I can hear you perfect.
Awesome. All right. Thank you so much, and I appreciate everyone attending today. My name is Paul Turley. I'm a principal consultant here with 3Cloud Solutions. And let me just share my screen. All right. So thank you again for joining this morning or this afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here again. I've done a couple of these presentations in the past for Pragmatic Works prior to the 3Cloud acquisition. But I'll introduce myself very quickly, and then we'll get into the meat of this presentation. This is what we're going to talk about. Quite honestly, I'm a very transparent person. When I talk about how I prepare presentations, I always put this slide in the deck to remind me what I had signed up to talk about. So this is what we're going to talk about today. A little bit about me very quickly. I've been a Microsoft Data Platform engineer Data Platform MVP in the Data Platform or SQL Server or Business Intelligence space for about 12 years now, just re-awarded not long ago. I actually started out my career in the television news business. I loved making pictures and pushing buttons. I really loved the technical side of that. And just to highlight how life changes course in the late 80s, I had an injury. I broke my foot. I was no longer mobile, and this was a very demanding job that required me to be on the go. And so after my injury, I took a job working at the help desk for a small healthcare software startup. And that sent my career in a completely different direction. I was actually working on a college degree in communications and broadcast journalism, and actually completely shifted course into IT, got into IT training and consulting. And in 2003, I went to work for a big 5 consulting company and learned about business intelligence and applied my SQL skills and some of my development skills and fell in love with analytics and BI. And since then, I've had the opportunity to participate as the lead author, solo author, and collaborating author on a number of books, which is something I really enjoyed doing. Spent a lot of nights and weekends writing technical books for Rox Press, Wiley Publishing, and some other publishing companies. And so I've been doing that for quite a while now. As I said, in 2009, I was awarded the MVP recognition from Microsoft, and I've been doing that, been very engaged in the larger community, working with Microsoft product teams, providing feedback, and been doing that for the past 12 years. Went to work for Pragmatic Works a few years back. I had a contractual relationship with Pragmatic Works for a very long time, then went to work for them as a full-time employee. And last August, Pragmatic Works was acquired by 3Cloud Solutions. And so we're still doing the same thing with the same great people. I think that's a sign of a great company when a year after an acquisition, pretty much everybody's still here, have the same team. It's just a larger team. We're growing and expanding, and it's been a really, really good ride. So earlier this year, my wife and I decided to do something crazy. We decided that since the kids are out of the house now, we decided to sell the house. We decided to purchase a motorhome, and we are living life on the road, working full time, continuing to do what I do, but being mobile. So I maintain 2 blogs. I've had SQL Server BI.blog. That's my technical blog where I talk about data and BI and Power BI. At SQL Server BI blog.com, and a fairly new video blog, Data on the Road, where I'm going to do interviews with my colleagues and other folks in the industry, talk about community as we travel the country. And so we're kind of setting sail at the beginning of October for a big trip, and heading down to your neighborhood, Crystal. We'll be heading toward Florida to speak at the Orlando Live Conference in November, and then we're going to hang out there for a while. All right, well, enough about me, and you're welcome to follow these blogs, and I do have some technical content out there on SQL Server BI blog related to what I'll be talking about today with demos and downloadable Power BI files, etc. All right, so let's talk about what we're going to talk about. So we're going to talk about how Power BI is a tool that is both enterprise ready and self-service BI. It's a tool that really meets both of those needs. And you know, it kind of reminds me of the story of the three blind men and the elephant. If you ask different people what Power BI is, you're likely to get different answers based on their experience and what they've read and what they've Googled. And Power BI is a lot of things to a lot of different people. And so the audience for your reporting solution needs to be considered. So we'll talk about that a little bit. So what do we mean in terms of enterprise scale when you think about reporting and analytics solutions? Well, data volume is one of the big considerations. We'll talk about architectural patterns for Power BI, talk about using Power BI with Excel, and et cetera, et cetera. So how do you optimize for scale as you break down the components of a BI solution, even within the scope of just the Power BI product, your data sources, your queries, your models, your DAX calculations, your reports. How do you plan for scale? How do you know when you need to throw something away and start over, or where you can continue to use what you have and leverage that to scale it into a more enterprise ready solution. Planning for separation, I'll explain what that means, and then planning for the future. Now, I've decidedly am not going to be doing demos during this presentation, simply because as this is a fairly new presentation, but it's based on material that I've presented in the past. And I'm going to point you to a number of resources, including recordings of demonstrations that are related to the topics that I will be covering. The reason I'm not going to be doing demonstrations is because as I've practiced this, it's taken about 2 hours. I got it down to about 90 minutes. We have 60 minutes today, so I'm going to point you to other places where we can actually take a look at these features in greater detail. A lot to talk about. So, is Power BI enterprise ready? Is it a tool that can be used for properly managed, properly governed, and developed solutions? Let me just pause here really quickly to say, if you have questions, please use the question area within GoToWebinar. I've asked Crystal to help me facilitate that a little bit. I'll be watching the question window, and I will pause and I'll ask if there are any questions. So please, you know, make this as interactive as possible. These are topics to drive a conversation, and there are a lot of things that we can talk about in terms of enterprise readiness. A lot of decision points that we're going to talk about. So one of the first things that we really consider is, if I'm working with large scale data, you know, what do we mean by large? That may mean different things to different people. Then that may take us from a ad hoc, self-service, or informal project realm into a more formal enterprise project and solution realm when we're working with a lot of data. When we have a lot of different users and different roles who use reports, dashboards, and analytics in different ways, that's enterprise scale. When we have a team of developers who need to collaborate and work together, that is enterprise scale. When we have data governance policies within an organization, as our organization matures, the organization is larger. When you're dealing with more data with a broader audience, it's probably more important for that data to be of high quality. Therefore, we have to have data governance policies. Power BI can absolutely support an environment where governance, data management, data quality is important. What about lifecycle and deployment? A challenging area in the past for Power BI. So how do you deploy to dev and test and promote to production with version control and team collaboration? There are some challenges, but we can certainly do it. And how do you manage versioning? What about embedding a solution, embedding reports, embedding visuals, embedding dashboards into another application, or being able to deploy it into an environment that kind of meets the same branding and the same user experience as with other familiar things. How do we automate it, administer it, etc. I'm going to point to one of a number of white papers. Microsoft have done a really good job of documenting and providing support and guidance around enterprise readiness and enterprise deployments. This is one of a handful of white papers that are available from Microsoft at Microsoft Docs. Realizing that you may download a PDF copy of this presentation that may not have the links in it. I've left the URL down there at the bottom. But if we actually go to that link, you'll see that Microsoft have several white papers. A lot of these are actually written by members of the community. The white paper that I'm actually mentioning here was written primarily by Melissa Coates, who is an independent consultant and longtime MVP, but with the collaboration of a number of folks at Microsoft. Chris Webb was the collaborator with her on that, and it was reviewed by a whole bunch of folks on the Power BI product team and the customer advisory team. So that's a resource that I would point you to. That's 260 pages just about. So there's a lot of great information in there. Okay, but when a lot of folks think about Power BI, based on their experience with Power BI, because it really kind of competes with and works in the same space as tools like Tableau and Click and a number of other ad hoc self-service BI tools, a lot of folks really think about Power BI as an ad hoc analytic tool. It's really, primarily for a user who has a need, and so they go download Power BI desktop and they go connect to some CSV files or an Excel spreadsheet. Maybe they get some SQL data out of a data warehouse or a relational system, and they munge all of that together. They do some quick reporting. They transform the data and shape it as they go so that they can get to a reporting experience. And so data modeling is more of an evolution. Don't really know what tables I need. I'm not quite sure where that's going to come from. I'm going to discover those sources as I go. I can munge all of that together. Power BI is a great tool for this type of design. Visualization is a try and see. All right, well, let's visualize that as a bar chart. That was okay. How about as a tree map? How about as a pie chart? Ooh. And so we can quickly and easily kind of switch out visualizations. And again, it's kind of an evolutionary process. And this is all awesome. But the bottom line, what this process typically generates is a solution that really doesn't conform to any kind of IT standard. We don't follow naming conventions. We don't build models to standards. Oftentimes those models kind of get cobbled together and we have to do creative things to come up with unique values to use as relational keys. And this is good. This is part of the process, but to evolve a project like that into an enterprise delivery, to make it available for 1,000 users within the organization may not yield the best outcome. So how do we manage this? Well, one, we need to understand our audience. And if the ultimate audience is everybody in the company or a large group of people, and we expect those reports to be used for decision support, and we expect them to be used, to support business processes, then we need to kind of back up the bus and rethink the way that we might design, the way that we connect to data, the way we transform, the way we model, and the way that we visualize and deliver those reports. So how do you know whether you start over, or how do you know whether you can build on top of that self-service project as a solution? Well, this is really part of iterative design. Once, you really have to define your solution scope. So how far do we need to go? What's the ultimate objective? How many users? How much data? What's the end goal? Then we work in iterative cycles. So in iterative development, we try to think big, but we also have to work in a small cycle. There's good and bad in this. You know, if we have all the requirements and everything is well understood up front, well, then you can build those requirements. And every developer wants that to happen. Every project manager tries to see that happen, but it's not the reality. So as we're working in cycles, we have to evaluate the design within that cycle. And then part of that evaluation is to say, all right, is this a feature that will support enterprise readiness? The way that I've connected to this data source, is that durable? If I were to go from 1,000 records to 1,000,000 records to 10 million records, you know, is that durable? Is it secure? Is it something that I can deploy out to the service and continue to support? And you're going to find that there are a lot of things that don't work, and so you have to discard those things that don't work. Creative technical people don't like to throw things away. We get kind of close to our creative solutions, and it's hard to part with that. Therefore, it's important to collaborate. It's important to have a second set of eyes, take a look at the way that something was designed, to be able to say, okay, well, you know, I think that this has legs. I think that you can continue to go with the way that you designed this query. However, this pivot transformation, that ain't gonna work when you add 10 million records to it. Or the way that you've connected to, let's say, a CSV file, might be better to connect to our data warehouse, or to be able to work with one of our developers to create a view, or maybe a process to support that. And so it's this constant kind of cycle of, this works, let's keep that, throw this away, back up the bus a little bit, and evolve that. We learn and improve as we go. We go back and we evaluate to the solution scope and decide whether perhaps our solution has reached its end of life and we need to start something else, or we can continue to build on top of that foundation. So if you break this down, it's really just a process of repeating that iteration through every component of our solution. So think about the way that I've connected to my data sources. Are these sources that are durable? Are they reliable? Is the data of sufficient quality? If I've connected to, let's say I've downloaded CSV files from a website, you know, perhaps that data would be better loaded into a data lake or a data warehouse or a database. So, you know, we just have to kind of think about each of these layers of our solution as source, the way that we've transformed the data. Would that work better in Azure Data Factory than in Power Query and Power BI? Perhaps I should think about creating a data flow within Power BI so that I can centralize that transformation logic. Same thing with the data model design. Keep portions of that, throw it away, and start over again. And again, it's important to have a second pair of eyes. At 3Cloud, as people are working through solutions, we are constantly inviting others to take a look at our work, to do code reviews. Within teams, we have an SOS channel where someone will say, hey, I'm working with this client on this project. I've got this challenge. I've got a couple of choices. Could somebody either tell me what you believe the best practice is, point me to a resource, or let's just schedule a meeting really quick, take 15 minutes to look at it. And we get a lot, you know, we produce much higher quality work when we work together, and when we have an open culture of doing peer reviews and code reviews, and we're open for someone saying, it's not the way I would have done that. You might think about doing this instead. And again, you know, does this conform to our development standards? Have I used proper naming conventions? You know, or is the source to the visual traceable? If a user says, where does that number come from? Can you trace that back to where it came from and validate that? And then finally, the way that we're delivering the report. You know, are you using publish to web? That may not be secure. Are you publishing to a workspace and then sharing that with other users who have a pro license? What about users who don't have a pro license? Can we perhaps convert that workspace into an app and then make that available to read-only users within the company? And then we don't have to worry about licensing individual users. Lots of options here. You could also use the Power BI embedded service to make reports and visuals available to a broader audience if your requirements support that need. All right, so let's talk about architectural patterns. Some things to consider. So Is the current solution a good proof of concept that you can use to learn from? Is it something we can say, all right, we learned some things. Now we have enough information to define our requirements and to be able to scope out a larger proper solution according to industry best practices. So this will serve as a reference point, but we're not going to build on top of this solution. That's good news. That's a good investment of time and effort. Or is it a solid foundation that you can build upon? Can you back up the bus in the right places and then continue to use that, set up queries, your data model, perhaps even some of your visual reports to build on top of? So quickly, as we think about different ways that Power BI can be used within an enterprise solution, let's start with a non-enterprise solution: self-service data prep and analysis. Power BI desktop, connect to data sources, import the data, model it, and deliver visuals. This is the 90 or 95% use case for Power BI. This is what most people think about. Says data is imported, it's imported into an in-memory model that's managed in a single PBIX file. You deploy that out to a workspace, share it with users, bada boom, bada bing, you're done. However, that may not necessarily be fully enterprise scale ready. So then we can think about using a curated data source, like a relational SQL database as your data mart or your data warehouse. If we're working entirely within the cloud rather than on-prem, we may be using tools like Azure Data Lake to stage data, Azure Data Factory to transform and orchestrate the movement of data pipelines into the data warehouse or relational database. As of late, we're working on a lot of projects that use technologies like Databricks and Delta Lake, where we're not using a relational database, but the data lake storage is represented as a SQL database, and we can use SQL connectors to import that data into Power BI. And so on. And we can kind of take this to the next level and think about using Synapse Analytics as our storage engine, or Databricks with Delta Lake as our storage engine. And then data flows are also an excellent choice. Data flows serve a lot of different purposes, and data flows I think are both enterprise scale and kind of moderate scale, in that if you don't have a proper data warehouse, if the data isn't already shaped into dimension and fact tables, you can use data flows to build kind of a mini data warehouse and then build data models on top of that with Power BI. But data flows also enable some very large enterprise scale capability that can be used on top of more structured, more managed data sources as well. All right. Excel. We often work with financial users and will build a data model and visualize data over that data model. And so they've got these beautiful dashboards or dashboard style reports with charts and matrices and drill through actions and all of these awesome things. And a financial user will often say, okay, that's great, but how do I export that to Excel? Because I want to use the tool that I know how to use. And if they're working with numbers, maybe it just makes sense to work within a spreadsheet format. The fact of the matter is that Power BI works extremely well with Excel. Excel is part of the Microsoft BI ecosystem. So how do we do that? Well, one, we need to teach analyst users how to use Excel with Power BI rather than just using Power BI data sets as a method to download and silo data, create copies of data. So rather than export, you connect to a data set. It's an easy thing to do within a workspace, either from a report or from a data set. You choose Analyze in Excel. Now there's an add-in for Excel where a user can open Excel and say, I want to go connect to a Power BI data set that's been shared with me, or from the data set, that just use the menu option to to implement Analyze in Excel, and that opens up Excel, creates an ODC file with connection information, and then the user can browse that data using a pivot table. So it's much like the experience they would have, back when we were using multidimensional cubes. If you still have multidimensional cubes, or connecting to an analysis services tabular model, which literally is the same technology as the modeling capabilities within Power BI. And now users are browsing live, curated, trustworthy data, one version of the truth. Analyze in Excel is a fantastic feature, and it's now just available in pretty much every licensing mode for Power BI. The experience out of the box is that they use a pivot table with filters and slicers. But for those Excel power users who say, oh gosh, well, I'd really like to insert a column here, or I'd really like to insert a row here, and I'd like to move these values off into different cells, you can convert that pivot table into a range of cell function references. So each cell uses cell functions. Easy stuff to do. And I've got some demonstrations on that on my blog, and it's actually a pretty easy thing to find. This is life-changing for financial users who want to use Excel natively. Okay, version control and lifecycle management. Let me just pause right here and see if we have any questions. I've got the chat or the question window open, but it's collapsed here, and I'm having trouble seeing it. I'm going to undock that. Aha, we do have questions. Okay, see that there's a person who had some audio problems. I'm assuming everybody else can hear me. I sure hope so. All right, so version control and lifecycle management. So this has been a challenging thing with Power BI in the past. There are actually some really good answers to how you manage version control and facilitate team collaboration for Power BI. Easy answer is, after you've separated your data model from your report, it becomes much easier to manage the data model as an IT entity, as a development resource with standard version control and standard deployment tools. So I have a slide a little bit later. We're going to talk about separating the data model from the report. But in my mind, that is paramount. As you think about delivering an enterprise solution, first of all, let me start by saying it's much easier to open up Power BI Desktop to do your data import, transformation, and modeling, and then do your visualization in a single file. It's more convenient to do that in a single file within Power BI Desktop. However, in every enterprise scale Power BI project, you'll reach a point where it just makes sense to separate the data model from the report in two different files. Now you have the data model that doesn't have to be redeployed every time a visual changes, every time you add a report page, or every time you tweak a visual or change something visually. That data model can remain more stable, and you don't have to worry about pushing a big file up into the service every time you make a visual change. So that's number one. Secondly, is if you want to manage your data model as an IT asset, if you want to manage it within a proper development tool, perhaps version it, use scripts to build and deploy it, promote it through your application lifecycle process, dev, QA, production. You can do that by converting the PBIX file, which defines the data model, into a model.bim file. So if you have worked with SQL Server analysis services doing development within Visual Studio, you can do that with a Power BI data model. And the way that you convert a PBIX to a model.bim is two things. One, you can use Visual Studio to point to a deployed data set in a premium workspace, use the XMLA endpoint, and you can import that database, so that data model or data set is literally an analysis services database. You just point to it and you can import that into a Visual Studio project. That's number one. Secondly, use a tool called Tabular Editor. And by using Tabular Editor, you can very simply connect to an open PBIX file and resave the model to a model.bim. It's a one-way trip. You cannot go from model.bim to PBIX, which means that you can't go back and enhance the model with Power BI Desktop. But you can move it into model.bim using Tabular Editor, either the free version, version 2, or using the now enhanced version, Tabular Editor version 3, which does have a cost associated with it. It's an awesome tool, either of those tools. Or you can continue to use Visual Studio. I did a blog post about a year ago, and I threw a little temper tantrum about some of the challenges of using Visual Studio with large complex data models. And fact of the matter is that Microsoft are really relying on the community to continue the journey of supporting tabular model development with tools like Tabular Editor, and we're not seeing a lot of innovation within Visual Studio. And that's a reality just to be aware of, that Microsoft are not continuing to invest in that experience. But I continue to use Visual Studio for some of these projects, but I would strongly recommend that you use Tabular Editor. So that takes care of versioning, differencing, team collaboration, check in, check out. Be very, very cautious about trying to merge changes within different model.bim files, because you can break a tabular model very, very easily by trying to do manual merges. With reports are defined as a binary file. It's really a reality. And so the method that I typically use is I will postfix file names. I will keep all of my Power BI assets in OneDrive for Business, which is SharePoint, and then just use the natural version control. So if I've enhanced a report and I've broken something or I've done something that I need to revert back, you can use OneDrive for Business to simply go back to an earlier version. So, it's rudimentary, but that's really the reality of how that works. Okay, so let's talk about promoting self-service reports into enterprise scale. A question, a couple questions. Does the .bim require a premium license? No, it absolutely does not require a premium license. The first method that I mentioned, using the XMLA endpoint to use a tool like Visual Studio or SQL Server Management Studio for that matter, to connect to a deployed data set within a Power BI workspace, that does require either premium per user or premium for capacity to do that. However, to use, let's say, a tool like Tabular Editor to point to an open PBIX file on your desktop, convert that to a model.bim, and then to continue to work with that. That desktop conversion doesn't require premium. However, using the XMLA endpoint to manage the deployment does require premium. I think I just answered my own question there. So yes, I think that the premium is a necessity once you've done that. You mentioned separating the data model and report file. I've noticed that performance tools like Dex Studio won't work. Is that correct? No, I have not seen that. I think we'd have to get into the weeds of that question a little bit and look at specific use cases. But no, Dex Studio works just fine with a separate data set, whether it's managed as a PBIX file or as a model.bim file. I use Dex Studio for performance tuning and analysis all the time with separate data sets. What do you do about permissions for various users? Oh, big question. I'm going to talk about that. So we need to forge ahead. Can we use Azure DevOps for PBIX files for version control? All right, this is an excellent question. Can you use Azure DevOps? You can use Azure DevOps to check in and check out and manage any file, as long as it's not too big. We cannot use, with a PBIX file, we cannot use version control and build management tools, whether it's Azure DevOps or Git or anything else, to do versioning, differencing, merging, splitting, that kind of thing with a PBIX file, simply because it's a binary file. And even if you were to get into the innards of that file, because literally it is a zip file, and you can break it into components, and if you were to split out the contents of a PBIX file, you'd see that there's some JSON in there, there's some XML in there, there's a little bit of binary stuff in there. You can split that out, and we have successfully been able to break these things out into files and check them into source control and manage components and put them back together. Microsoft does not support this scenario, and under certain conditions you can get it to work. I'm going to say don't try it, don't do it. And so the simple answer to the question is you can check these files in, and you can put them into a repository. You just can't use those features that split the file up and make changes to it. So I would say check your report files, the report PBIX file that doesn't have any data into it. Use DevOps for that. But the models, I would convert them to a model.bim, and then you can use Azure DevOps or other version control tools. Just don't merge and split them. Okay, and will you be covering custom processing? Covering as a topic, yes, I'm not demonstrating. Let me move ahead and we'll come back to questions. So for non-governed data sets, and so this is for the ad hoc analyst who uses Power BI to do their own mashups and quickly analyze data for their own purposes. Teach them how to use Power BI to perform those functions, with the understanding that it's not always going to be perfect, that there should be some tolerance for lack of data quality. And so I quote the old Magic School Bus, Ms. Frizzle: make mistakes, get messy. It's part of a process. And then have a designated workspace to deploy those non-governed data sets. When we work with large enterprise clients, we will typically suggest that there be a workspace for each business area that data sets and reports are deployed to. Those are then converted into an app. Then we use deployment pipelines to deploy and manage those as trusted, governed BI assets. And then we have other workspaces that are designated for users. It's a sandbox. It's an area where they can play, and they may be less trustworthy, and that is an expectation of that group. User-authored solutions can be used to prototype and build patterns for governed models. So it's part of the process of migration. And then IT needs to be involved, and there needs to be kind of a collaborative effort between the business users who create those Power BI models and reports, and then the governed models that we either evolve them into or we use those as POC patterns to get to governed solutions. So publish those to a secured and managed workspace, either performed by business data analysts or transition to IT developers who actually do the development and do the deployment into those secured managed workspaces. Within Power BI, we have the ability, and this is a premium feature, we have the ability to mark a data set as trusted and certified. It's either promoted or it's certified. You can also use data flows to standardize your data models. Again, data flows work really well to kind of build a small scale data warehouse of trusted business entities and trusted queries, and then you can build models from that. And then end users, enable users to connect to published data sets to create their own reports, and they can do that within the service. Okay. Direct query mode is a feature that has its place. It's an important feature. So let me just explain what this means very quickly if you haven't really worked with import versus direct query mode. In its natural state, Power BI utilizes the Vertipack in-memory tabular modeling engine for data modeling. So when you publish a data model to a data set within the Power BI service, that data set or that data model naturally stores data in the service where each column is compressed separately and it's optimized for analytics. Highly performant, awesome stuff, but it is a copy of your data that's cached. You can reprocess it, but it's a copy of your data. You can also use a feature called DirectQuery. Now, DirectQuery works around the tabular modeling engine and it allows you to maintain a connection back to the source database. SQL database professionals oftentimes will look at DirectQuery and go, oh, this is awesome. I already know how to optimize SQL Server. And so we're just going to connect to my SQL Server tables. And then all the queries will actually happen on the SQL Server. No reason to refresh, no reason to worry about keeping the data up to date by refreshing. This is great. The problem with that is that it doesn't use all the optimizations that are part of the Vertipack engine. So my recommendation is that generally 99% of your projects are going to use import mode. DirectQuery serves the purpose of handling edge cases where import mode might be challenging. So Power BI is optimized to import data into memory. It uses columnar compression. You're going to get the best performance. All of the DAX functions work with import mode. DirectQuery, by contrast, doesn't copy data in the model, so you don't incur any storage cost, and it uses less memory when the model is at rest. However, when queries are running, lots of caching and things are going on, which can slow things down. So what's the best balance of these two? It's to use composite models. And the idea behind a composite model is that you're starting with import mode. Import everything except for those few tables where DirectQuery would be advantageous. If I have a transactional table with 100 million rows in it, and that doesn't fit into my data model, or it would bloat the data model to the point where it would slow everything else down, that's a good candidate for DirectQuery. And then we're going to drill through to that. We're not going to load the 100 million rows, in one query result at one time. Okay, this is certified and shared data sets. So if we go into the service and look at a workspace, again, premium feature, you can see that under the endorsement column, someone who has permission can say this data set is promoted. We believe that it is of sufficient quality that when people connect to it, they realize that it's semi-trustworthy. We want to promote it. Or we can certify it, meaning that this is completely vetted. We believe that it is a single version of the truth, and it's endorsed as such. Okay, this is an important concept and a pattern that I try to follow in most, if not all, of my Power BI solutions. Even if you do not plan to deploy a fully enterprise scale data model, first of all, we want to use dimensional modeling techniques. So we have our dimension tables. Dimension tables generally are lookup tables that don't have a large volume of data. There are exceptions to that. There can be large dimension tables, but generally speaking, they're fairly small. So we don't need to worry about how long it takes to refresh those tables. We can do a full load of a dimension table usually pretty quickly. And we generally don't have ranges of dates that we could use to partition or incrementally refresh those tables. But our fact tables, the tables that contain the numeric information that are going to feed our measures, that we're going to do calculations and time series calculations over, those tables, I want to choose a column that I can use for partitioning, a date, time, type column that I can use for partitioning. So in this example, I have a sales table where my order date column is a date time type. Now, even if it's a date type, The requirement of the incremental refresh feature is that it actually be converted and stored as a date time type. It doesn't really add a lot of overhead as it would if we were using SQL Server. And then I'm going to create two partitions in Power Query. I'll create a partition called range start, that's a date time type, and a range end, that is also a date time type. And then within the Power Query itself, I'm going to create a range filter. And you do that simply by adding a filter step and then saying, I want to use a date filter. I'm going to use a between. That gives me this dialog. And I'm going to say that my order date column is after or equal to, and I point to this range start parameter, and is before range end. Now, even if I don't need to use incremental refresh or partitioning, I'm going to do this so that when I load that model up full of data, I can say, all right, I want to go January 1 through March 31. All right, 3 months worth of data. I get a moderate scale of data that's not going to create a real large PBIX file on my desktop. And I'm going to work with that. I'm going to design my reports. And now I need to do a year-over-year comparison. Well, I can't do that with 3 months worth of data. So I'll just go change the range end, and I'll set that to the end of the following year. And then I'll refresh that. Takes a while to load up 2 years worth of data. PBIX file is going to be larger. And now I'm able to design and test my year-over-year measures. Okay, but let's say my PBIX file is 800 megabytes in size, which would take a long time to deploy. I would then go back, change the range end again, go back to 3 months. Now I have a very small PBIX file. I deploy that one up to the service. And then in the service, I go and change the range end again, refresh it in the service. I'm good to go, and I didn't have to push an 800 megabyte file up into the service. So I have this fairly small portable PBIX file. All right, so that meets one requirement, just managing the size of your file. Now I'm in enterprise mode. So I have a, if my PBIX is going to be larger than 1 gigabyte, I'm going to need premium in some form, whether it's premium per user or premium capacity. I'm going to turn on incremental refresh. And this is actually done right in Power BI Desktop. I can do it in the data grid view, or I can do it in the report design view. I just go to the ellipsis for the table. I choose incremental refresh, and that gives me this dialog where I say, for this fact table, I want to partition it by, here I'm going to do 12 years. I think I wanted to do months there since I chose 12. Let's say that I choose, let's do 36 months. And so I would say, all right, I want monthly partitions over a period of 3 years. So I'm going to say 36 months. However, the last, let's say 3 months, I always want to refresh. What happens is the Power BI service is going to go generate individual partitions for each of those months. And it will actually detect whether data has changed within that range of dates and process only the partitions that are necessary. Incremental refresh is a wonderful feature. And if you're in a very advanced mode, you actually want to build your own partitions, you can then go use Tabular Editor or Visual Studio to write XMLA script, and you can use a very similar technique to manually build out your own partitions. Advanced feature, not enough time to talk about it. Just know that Power BI has that capability. And yes, this is premium only because we have to use the XMLA endpoint. All right, how do we future-proof our solutions? Now, quoting Yoda, difficult to see, always in motion, the future is. This is the great balance of enterprise development, is how do I understand my requirements sufficiently enough to architect a solution and then build that solution in iterations on a solid enough foundation to be able to make it durable. Every solution will eventually run out of steam. You will eventually have requirements that you didn't architect for. But hopefully that's years in the future, not months in the future. So how is the source data procured and maintained? You know, is that durable both on the desktop and in the service, and then for the masses if you have hundreds or thousands of users? Who is responsible for maintaining that source data? So we're talking about data stewardship. We're getting into data governance now. And then who developed the solution, and is there a backup for that person if they win the lottery? Do we have a team of people who are prepared to support this solution in the future? Where are the files? Are they in source control? Are they versionable? Again, we just need to think about what could go wrong, and do we have a backup plan to get there? And eventually, how are users assigned permissions, et cetera. So let's talk a little bit about different ways that we can optimize. And I know that I'm running out of time, so I'm going to kind of cherry pick just a little bit. Reduce clutter. The best way to make a project future-proof and perform well is to reduce the number of columns and reduce the clutter within your queries. Big important question here is, does a data source fold? If you don't know what that means, look it up. Query folding is important. You don't always have to plan for query folding, but big, tall tables, fact tables, they should fold. If you're connecting to a data source that supports query folding, meaning that the query is processed at the source rather than in Power BI, it's important to do that. One of the easiest ways to do that with a relational database is to either connect directly to a table or a view. Don't write hand-authored SQL within Power Query. I get a lot of pushback from database professionals on that point, but it's important, and I've got plenty of blog posts where I've talked about why that's important. Reduce the number of steps within Power Query, and an easy way to do that is do all the like things, like changing data types, do them all at the same time. So rather than changing the name of a column, changing its data type, changing another column, changing a data type, removing a column, changing the, et cetera, which would generate a lot of steps, this takes a lot longer than this does, and Power Query is smart enough to consolidate into single steps. Again, I've got lots of material on that. Dimensionalize your models. I truly, truly believe that nearly any reporting data can be shaped into a star schema, at least a snowflake schema. And even if it's transactional data and it doesn't naturally fit into a star, Power BI is for analytic reporting. It's not for transactional reporting. And so shape your data into a star schema. There are great books on this, and it's an important thing to understand and to master. All right, planning for scale, how many rows do you need to store? How many users do you need to support? That's going to translate into the way that you license Power BI. We have premium per user now, which is merely roughly $20 per user per month, rather than having to spend $5,000 retail for premium capacity. However, if you have several hundred users, it may be more cost effective to use premium capacity. Keep in mind that a lot of the features that are needed to manage enterprise scale solutions are premium features, and that's a reality. Power BI is a fantastic product, but premium is there for a reason, and I think that just needs to be factored into the cost. How big can your models be? They can be any size that you want. You literally can go up to terabytes and petabytes, but we need to use features like composite models to do that. Okay. More reference material for you. I have a complete series of blog posts where I go into the details of how to separate your data model from your reports and tools that you can use. Steve Campbell, an MVP, he developed an extension that will allow you to reconnect a PBIX file to a different PBIX data model or data set. And it's a great tool that I use for desktop development once I've separated my report to be able to reconnect it to different versions of that data model or data set. Visualize with care. The more visuals that you add to a page, the more queries that you're running, and that can impact performance. Queries are grouped into sets of 5. So if you have 5 separate visuals that produce 5 separate DAX queries as your user is interacting with that report, those 5 queries can run in parallel against the data model. However, if you have 10 separate visuals that would generate 10 separate queries, the first 5 have to finish before the next 5 can run. So in this example, which is purposely blurred because it's sensitive client data, there were 70 separate visuals, and that was taking over 2 minutes to render. This was a DirectQuery model, which was one of the problems, but there were reasons that it needed to be. In this video that I would encourage you to take a look at on my blog, I spent some time with my colleague Carol Perian, who walked us through performance tuning this report. And this is the performance analyzer, which shows that we've got visuals that are taking 22 seconds to render. And he was able to, just one by one, breaking them down, figuring out where the problem points were and optimizing for that. Again, moving from DirectQuery to import mode would have increased performance by a factor of 10 at least, but since that was a constraint, he was able to get this down to a reasonable period of time, which I think was 10 or 20 seconds for the whole page. All right, data governance and data culture. I had a great sit-down talk. This is on my Data on the Road blog with Matthew Roach from the Power BI Customer Advisory team. And Matthew has done a whole series, 17 separate video posts about building a data culture within your business, managing data governance, and IT working with business. The more data you have as we get into enterprise scale, the more that Venn diagram of people, process, and technology leans toward people and process, meaning that as technologists, we can't solve the entire problem without having a business champion, without having data stewards, without the business taking ownership of their portion of the solution. It's important that we have and facilitate that culture. That's the way it's always been. I think BI and analytics amplifies the need for business engagement. All right. So that's actually my last slide. I actually finished on time, which gives us a little bit of time to go back and answer questions. So let me do that. I've left the remainder of the deck are resources that point back to some previous presentations that I've done, as well as some checklists that I've created to kind of help provide guidance around the right way to think about building enterprise Power BI solutions. So I'll leave that as reference material for you, and let's go back.